Sarah Chen had always been different. Growing up in a small farming town in Montana, she spent her childhood helping her grandfather maintain his vast property while other girls her age were playing with dolls or learning to braid hair. Her grandfather, a Korean War veteran named Thomas Chen, had taught her everything he knew about firearms, hunting, and survival. What made Sarah truly special wasn't just her natural talent with a rifle, but her deep respect for the old ways of doing things. The rifle that would later make her famous had been sitting in her grandfather's gun safe for over 60 years. It was a 1953 Springfield M1A, a semi-automatic rifle that had seen action in conflicts most people only read about in history books. The wood stock was worn smooth from decades of handling, and the metal showed the kind of patina that only comes with age and proper care. To most people, especially young Marines fresh out of boot camp, it looked like something that belonged in a museum rather than on a modern battlefield. Sarah's journey to the Marine Corps shooting range that would change everything began 3 years earlier when she decided to enlist after college. She had graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering, but something about the structured life and the challenge of military service called to her. Her grandfather had been hesitant at first, worried that the military might change his granddaughter's independent spirit, but he eventually gave her his blessing, along with something even more precious, his old rifle. The day Sarah arrived at Camp Pendleton for advanced marksmanship training, she carried the M1A in a worn leather case that looked as old as the rifle itself. The other recruits, mostly men in their early 20s, immediately noticed the unusual weapon. While they carried modern M4 carbines and state-of-the-art sniper systems, Sarah unpacked what looked like a relic from another era. "Is that thing even legal to use here?" asked Private Rodriguez, a cocky young man from Texas who had been bragging about his hunting experiences since day one of training. He leaned over to get a better look at Sarah's rifle, his expression a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "It's completely legal," Sarah replied calmly, running her hand along the familiar wooden stock. "My grandfather carried this rifle in Korea. It's been in my family for decades." The laughter started small, just a few chuckles from the Marines standing nearby. But as word spread through the training company about the woman with the antique rifle, the jokes grew louder and more frequent. Some called it a museum piece, others referred to it as Grandpa's old hunting rifle. The worst comments came from Sergeant Mills, a drill instructor who seemed to take personal offense at Sarah's choice of weapon. "Chen!" he barked during the first day of range training. "What do you think this is? A Civil War reenactment? That rifle belongs in a display case, not on my firing line." Sarah stood at attention, her rifle held at port arms. "Sergeant, this weapon is fully functional and meets all specifications for the training exercise." "Functional?" Sergeant Mills walked closer, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Chen, while you're loading that antique one round at a time, the enemy will have moved to another zip code. This isn't your grandfather's war anymore." The other Marines laughed, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. But she had learned from her grandfather never to let others' opinions shake her confidence. The old man had taught her that respect wasn't given freely. It had to be earned through actions, not words. The first week of training focused on basic marksmanship principles: breathing, trigger control, sight alignment, and position stability. Sarah excelled in the classroom portions, demonstrating a deep understanding of ballistics and wind compensation that impressed even the instructors. However, the real test would come on the firing line, where theories became reality and reputations were made or broken. The morning of their first live fire exercise dawned clear and cold. The Pacific wind was gusting across the range at 15 to 20 miles per hour, creating challenging conditions for even experienced shooters. Sarah arrived early, as was her habit, and began the careful process of preparing her rifle for the day's shooting. Unlike her fellow Marines, who simply loaded magazines and performed quick function checks on their modern weapons, Sarah's preparation ritual was more involved. She carefully cleaned the barrel with a bore snake, checked the scope mounts for tightness, and examined each cartridge before loading it into the rifle's internal magazine. The .308 Winchester cartridges were hand-loaded by her grandfather, each one crafted with the precision of a jeweler working on a fine watch. "Still playing with that museum piece?" Private Johnson asked as he set up his modern sniper system at the firing position next to Sarah's. His rifle was a state-of-the-art weapon worth more than most people's cars, complete with advanced optics and a suppressor that gave it an intimidating appearance. "Just getting ready," Sarah replied, adjusting the leather sling her grandfather had taught her to use for additional stability. The sling was another piece of old-school equipment that drew snickers from the other Marines, most of whom relied on bipods and other modern shooting aids. The targets for the day's exercise were set at various distances, starting at 300 yards and extending out to 800 yards. The course was designed to simulate real-world shooting scenarios, with targets appearing and disappearing at random intervals. Each Marine would be scored not only on accuracy but also on speed and the ability to engage multiple targets quickly. As the Marines took their positions on the firing line, the jokes about Sarah's rifle continued. Someone behind her whispered that she would probably need a scope adjustment every other shot, while another Marine loudly wondered if the rifle would even cycle properly with modern ammunition. Sarah ignored the comments, focusing instead on the lessons her grandfather had drilled into her during countless hours on their family's private range. "The rifle doesn't make the shooter," he had told her many times. "The shooter makes the rifle." A master craftsman can create beautiful work with simple tools, while a novice will struggle even with the finest equipment. The range safety officer called for silence as the exercise began. The first targets appeared at 300 yards, simple silhouettes that would test basic accuracy. Sarah took a deep breath, settled into her shooting position, and began to demonstrate exactly what her grandfather had meant about the relationship between shooter and rifle. Her first shot rang out, the distinctive crack of the .308 cartridge cutting through the morning air. The old rifle's recoil was more pronounced than the modern weapons around her, but Sarah had learned to manage it through years of practice. More importantly, she had learned to call her shots, meaning she could tell where each bullet would hit based on the sight picture and trigger press. "Hit," called the spotter, confirming that Sarah's bullet had found its mark. Around her, the other Marines were firing rapidly, their semi-automatic weapons chattering as they engaged the targets. Sarah's rate of fire was slower, limited by the rifle's internal magazine capacity and her deliberate shooting style. But each shot was carefully aimed and precisely placed. The morning progressed through various shooting positions and distances. Sarah's performance was solid but not spectacular, and the jokes about her rifle continued. Several of the other Marines were shooting faster and achieving good scores with their modern equipment, leading to increased confidence in their superior firepower. During the lunch break, Sergeant Mills approached Sarah as she was cleaning her rifle. "Chen, I have to admit, you're not embarrassing yourself out there. But this afternoon we're moving out to longer ranges, and that antique of yours is going to show its age. Why don't you switch to a standard weapon and save yourself the humiliation?" Sarah looked up from her cleaning, her dark eyes meeting the sergeant's challenging stare. "Thank you for the concern, Sergeant, but I'll stick with what I know." "Your funeral," Mills replied, walking away with a shake of his head. The afternoon session would prove to be the turning point that everyone was expecting, just not in the way they anticipated. The targets were now placed at 600, 700, and 800 yards, distances where wind, elevation, and ammunition quality became critical factors. The Marine Corps had designed this exercise to separate the truly skilled marksmen from those who had simply gotten lucky at shorter ranges. As the afternoon wind picked up, creating even more challenging shooting conditions, Sarah began her final preparations. She had been studying the wind patterns all morning, noting how the grass moved at various points downrange and watching the mirage through her scope. Her grandfather had taught her to read these natural indicators, skills that were often overlooked in modern training programs that relied heavily on electronic wind meters and ballistic computers. The other Marines were struggling with the changing conditions. Their modern rifles were accurate, but the shooters behind them lacked the experience to compensate for the complex wind patterns. Shots that had been hitting center mass at 300 yards were now missing targets entirely at the longer ranges. Sarah, however, was in her element. The longer ranges played to the strengths of both her rifle and her training. The heavier .308 bullets were less affected by wind than the smaller calibers favored by some of the modern weapons, and her years of practice reading natural wind indicators gave her an advantage that no amount of technology could replicate. Her first shot at 600 yards was a center hit, followed by another, then another. The spotters were calling out perfect scores as Sarah methodically engaged each target. Around her, the chatter and joking had died down as the other Marines began to realize that something unusual was happening. By the time the exercise moved to 800 yards, word had spread throughout the range that the woman with the old rifle was outshooting everyone else. Instructors who had been working with other students began drifting over to watch Sarah's performance. Even Sergeant Mills, who had been so dismissive earlier, found himself paying close attention to her technique. The final challenge of the day was a rapid-fire exercise at 700 yards. Each Marine had to engage 5 targets in succession, with points awarded for both accuracy and speed. This was where the modern rifles were supposed to shine, with their large magazine capacities and fast cycling rates. Sarah took her position, checking her rifle one final time before the targets appeared. She had loaded 8 rounds into the rifle's internal magazine, giving her a small margin for error. Unlike the other Marines, who planned to spray bullets down range and hope for hits, Sarah intended to make every shot count. The targets popped up, and Sarah began shooting with a rhythm that surprised everyone watching. Despite the rifle's slower rate of fire, she was engaging targets almost as quickly as the Marines with modern weapons. More importantly, every shot was finding its mark with mechanical precision. The distinctive sound of her rifle's action cycling became a metronome marking perfect shot placement. While other Marines were struggling to get hits at the extreme range, Sarah was putting bullet after bullet into the center scoring rings. By the time she fired her 8th and final shot, the entire range had fallen silent. The final scores were announced an hour later, after all targets had been scored and verified. Sarah had achieved a perfect score on the long-range portion of the exercise, outperforming every other Marine in her training class. More impressive was her overall score for the entire day, which was the highest recorded in the training company's recent history. The Marines who had been joking about her rifle all morning were now staring in shocked silence. The same weapon they had dismissed as outdated and obsolete had just dominated their modern equipment in the hands of someone who truly understood how to use it. Sergeant Mills approached Sarah as she was packing up her rifle for the day. His expression was completely different from the dismissive attitude he had shown earlier. "Chen," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I've been instructing Marines for 15 years, and I've never seen shooting like that." "Thank you, Sergeant," Sarah replied, carefully placing the rifle back in its worn leather case. "But the rifle deserves most of the credit. It's been taking care of my family for 60 years. As Sarah walked off the firing line that evening, she could hear the conversation starting behind her. The Marines who had laughed at her weapon that morning were now asking detailed questions about her technique, her ammunition, and her training. Some were even wondering if they should reconsider their own equipment choices. But Sarah knew that the real test was still to come. Today had been just the beginning of her journey to prove that skill, dedication, and respect for proven methods could triumph over the latest technology. Her grandfather had always told her that the first victory is often the hardest, but it's also the one that opens doors to even greater challenges. The story of the woman with the ancient rifle was just beginning to spread through Camp Pendleton, and soon it would reach ears that would present Sarah with an opportunity to prove herself on an even bigger stage. The casual jokes and dismissive comments were over. Now came the real test of whether one person's dedication to excellence could change minds and earn the respect that had been withheld for too long. Word of Sarah's incredible performance on the firing line spread through Camp Pendleton like wildfire. Within 48 hours, Marines from different companies were talking about the woman who had embarrassed an entire training class with what they called an antique rifle. The story grew with each telling, as military stories often do, but the core facts remained unchanged. Sarah Chen had achieved something remarkable, with a weapon that others had dismissed as obsolete. The news reached Colonel Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of the base's advanced marksmanship program, by the end of the week. Colonel Hayes was a veteran of 3 combat deployments and had earned her reputation as one of the finest shooters in the Corps. She was also someone who believed firmly in merit over appearances, making her the perfect person to evaluate Sarah's unusual situation. "Sergeant Mills," Colonel Hayes called during her weekly staff meeting, "I want you to tell me about Private Chen. And I want the unvarnished truth, not some embellished barracks story." Mills straightened in his chair, knowing that Colonel Hayes had little patience for exaggeration. "Ma'am, I've been training Marines for 15 years. And I've never seen anything like what she did last week. Perfect score at 800 yards with a rifle that's older than most of the Marines carrying it." "What kind of rifle?" the colonel asked. though she had already heard rumors about Sarah's weapon choice. M1A, ma'am, Springfield Armory, manufactured in 1953. Belonged to her grandfather, apparently. The thing looks like it should be in a museum, but Chen handles it like it's part of her body. Colonel Hayes leaned back in her chair, processing this information. She had served long enough to know that sometimes the most unlikely situations produce the most valuable discoveries. I want to see this for myself. Set up a demonstration for next Wednesday. And, Sergeant, I want you to invite some of our best shooters to participate. Let's see how Private Chen performs against some real competition. The demonstration that Colonel Hayes had ordered quickly evolved into something much larger. Word leaked out, as it always did in the close-knit military community, and soon Marines from across the base were requesting permission to observe. What had started as a simple skills assessment was becoming a major event that would test not only Sarah's abilities but also challenge some long-held assumptions about equipment and training methods. Sarah learned about the demonstration on Monday morning when Sergeant Mills pulled her aside after the daily training session. "Chen, you've attracted some attention with that rifle of yours. Colonel Hayes wants to see what you can do under pressure." "What kind of demonstration, Sergeant?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You'll be shooting against some of the best marksmen on the base. These aren't training company Marines, Chen. These are combat veterans, Marine Scout snipers, and competitive shooters who eat, sleep, and breathe marksmanship. The Colonel wants to see if your performance last week was skill or just beginner's luck." Sarah felt a familiar knot form in her stomach, the same feeling she had experienced before every major competition in her civilian life. But along with the nervousness came excitement. This was the kind of challenge her grandfather had prepared her for. The moment when all those hours of practice and all those lessons about mental toughness would either pay off or prove insufficient. "Who else will be shooting?" she asked. "Staff Sergeant Martinez from the Scout Sniper Program, Gunnery Sergeant Thompson from the competition team, and Captain Williams from the Intelligence Battalion. All of them have combat experience, and all of them are considered among the best shooters in the Corps." That evening, Sarah called her grandfather from the base phone center. The conversation was brief, as their talks always were, but she needed to hear his voice before the biggest test of her shooting career. "Grandpa, they want me to prove myself against some of the best Marines on the base. I'm nervous about representing our family rifle in front of all these people." There was a long pause before Thomas Chen responded, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Sarah, that rifle has been tested in ways you can't imagine. It never let me down when my life depended on it, and it won't let you down now. But remember, it's just a tool. The real test is what's inside you, what you've learned about discipline and patience and respect for the craft. What if I fail? What if everyone was right about the rifle being outdated? Then you fail with honor, knowing you gave your best effort. But I don't think you're going to fail. You've got something these other Marines don't have. You understand that shooting isn't just about the latest technology. It's about the connection between the shooter, the rifle, and the target. Trust in that connection, and everything else will take care of itself." The days leading up to the demonstration were filled with intense preparation. Sarah spent every available moment on the range, not just practicing her shooting, but also studying the backgrounds of her opponents. She learned that Staff Sergeant Martinez had 3 combat tours and over 50 confirmed kills as a scout sniper. Gunnery Sergeant Thompson held several Marine Corps shooting records and had represented the military in national competitions. Captain Williams was a former Olympic trials participant who had joined the Marines after college. Each of these Marines would be bringing state-of-the-art equipment to the competition. Martinez used a custom-built rifle that cost more than most people's cars. Thompson shot with precision instruments that could calculate wind speed and atmospheric pressure automatically. And Captain Williams had access to ammunition that was manufactured too, tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Against this technological arsenal, Sarah would bring the same 60-year-old rifle that had drawn laughs just 2 weeks earlier. But she had also spent those 2 weeks learning everything she could about her opponent's strengths and weaknesses, studying their shooting styles, and looking for any advantage she could find. The demonstration was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon, giving the entire base plenty of time to spread the word. By the morning of the event, Marines were placing informal bets on the outcome. The odds were heavily against Sarah, with most betting that she would be overwhelmed by the competition and exposed as a one-hit wonder. Sarah arrived at the range 2 hours early, as was her custom, and began the careful process of preparing her rifle and her mind for the challenge ahead. The range had been set up with targets at multiple distances, from 500 yards out to 1,000 yards, creating a comprehensive test of long-range marksmanship skills. Colonel Hayes arrived an hour before the scheduled start time, accompanied by several other senior officers who had heard about the unusual competition. She approached Sarah, who was methodically checking her rifle's scope settings. "Private Chen, I'm Colonel Hayes. I've heard some interesting things about your shooting abilities." Sarah stood at attention. "Yes, ma'am. I hope to represent the Corps well today." "At ease," the colonel said, studying the rifle in Sarah's hands. "Tell me about this weapon. What makes it special?" "Ma'am, this rifle belonged to my grandfather during the Korean War. It's a 1953 Springfield M1A, chambered in .308 Winchester. The stock is original walnut, and the barrel has been re-crowned once, but is otherwise original. My grandfather taught me that a rifle like this doesn't just shoot bullets, it carries history and responsibility." Colonel Hayes nodded, impressed by Sarah's respectful but confident manner. "And you believe this old rifle can compete with modern equipment?" "Ma'am, I believe that the rifle is only as good as the person behind it. This rifle has proven itself in combat, and my grandfather taught me to honor that legacy by never settling for anything less than my best effort." As the other competitors arrived, Sarah could feel the atmosphere on the range change. These were serious shooters, men who had proven themselves in combat and competition. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from years of success, and their equipment reflected their status as elite marksmen. Staff Sergeant Martinez set up his custom rifle with the efficiency of a professional, each movement precise and practiced. His weapon was a work of art, with a carbon fiber stock, precision barrel, and optics that could probably spot a target on the moon. As he prepared for the competition, other Marines gathered around to admire his equipment and ask technical questions about its capabilities. Gunnery Sergeant Thompson's setup was even more impressive, incorporating electronic wind meters, ballistic computers, and ammunition that was sorted and weighed to incredible precision. His pre-competition routine looked like a scientific experiment, with measurements and calculations that would have impressed an aerospace engineer. Captain Williams was perhaps the most intimidating of all, not because of his equipment but because of his reputation. His rifle was elegant in its simplicity, a custom-built weapon that represented the pinnacle of precision manufacturing. But more impressive was his mental preparation, the focused calm that surrounded him as he prepared for the competition. In contrast to all this high-tech preparation, Sarah's routine looked almost primitive. She cleaned her rifle's barrel with a simple pull-through cord, loaded handcrafted cartridges into the internal magazine, and adjusted her scope based on experience rather than electronic calculations. To the casual observer, she looked hopelessly outgunned. The format of the competition was straightforward. Each shooter would engage targets at 500, 700, and 1,000 yards, with scoring based on both accuracy and consistency. The targets were military standard silhouettes, and each shooter would fire 5 rounds at each distance. Wind conditions were moderate but variable, creating the kind of challenges that would separate skilled shooters from exceptional ones. Colonel Hayes called the competitors together for a final briefing. "Gentlemen, and Private Chen, this is a demonstration, not a combat situation, but I expect each of you to perform to the best of your abilities. The reputation of Marine Corps marksmanship is at stake here, and I want to see shooting that reflects the excellence of our training programs." As the competition began, a crowd of nearly 200 Marines had gathered around the range. Word had spread throughout the base, and everyone wanted to see whether the woman with the antique rifle could hold her own against the Marine Corps' elite marksmen. The first stage was at 500 yards, a distance that all 4 competitors should handle easily. Staff Sergeant Martinez shot first, his custom rifle producing a tight group that earned appreciative murmurs from the crowd. Gunnery Sergeant Thompson followed with an even better performance, placing all 5 shots within a circle that could be covered by a quarter. Captain Williams demonstrated why he had nearly made the Olympic team, shooting a group so tight that the spotters needed magnification to separate the individual bullet holes. When his score was announced, a perfect 50 points out of 50, The crowd erupted in applause. Then it was Sarah's turn. She took her position behind the 60-year-old rifle, adjusted the leather sling that her grandfather had taught her to use, and began the breathing routine that had become second nature through years of practice. The range fell silent as she prepared to fire her first shot. The crack of the .308 cartridge echoed across the range, followed immediately by the distinctive sound of the M1A's action cycling. Sarah's first shot had found the center of the target, earning a perfect score. 4 more shots followed in quick succession, each one placed with mechanical precision in the target's center scoring ring. When the smoke cleared and the target was scored, Sarah had achieved something that surprised even her supporters. She had matched Captain Williams' perfect score, shooting just as accurately with her grandfather's old rifle as he had with his precision-built modern weapon. The second stage, at 700 yards, would prove even more challenging. The wind had picked up, creating swirling conditions that would test each shooter's ability to read and compensate for environmental factors. This was where experience and instinct would matter more than equipment, and where Sarah's unconventional training might finally pay dividends. Martinez shot first again, struggling slightly with the changing wind conditions. His group was still excellent by any standard, but not quite as tight as his performance at 500 yards. Thompson followed with a solid performance that demonstrated his technical precision, though the electronic wind meters seemed to be having trouble with the variable conditions. Captain Williams adapted to the challenging conditions with the skill that had made him famous, adjusting his point of aim for each shot based on his reading of the wind indicators. His group was excellent, though not quite as perfect as his previous performance. Sarah approached the firing line with the calm confidence that her grandfather had instilled in her from childhood. She had spent the morning watching the grass movement and mirage patterns, building a mental picture of the wind conditions that no electronic instrument could provide. More importantly, she had learned to trust her instincts about when to take each shot, waiting for the brief moments when the wind settled into predictable patterns. Her first shot at 700 yards was another center hit, followed by 4 more that grouped so tightly that the spotters initially thought she had missed the target entirely. Only when they checked with high-powered scopes did they confirm that all 5 shots had struck within an area smaller than a playing card. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Marines who had been joking about Sarah's rifle just hours earlier were now cheering her performance and asking each other how she was achieving such incredible accuracy with what they still considered primitive equipment. But the real test was still to come. The final stage at 1,000 yards would separate the truly exceptional shooters from those who were merely very good. At this distance, every variable mattered: wind speed and direction, atmospheric pressure, temperature, humidity, and the minute variations in ammunition performance. This was where the most expensive equipment was supposed to provide decisive advantages. The 4 competitors took a break before the final stage, giving them time to study the conditions and plan their approach to the ultimate challenge. Sarah used this time to make one final call to her grandfather, seeking the wisdom that had guided her throughout her shooting career. "The last stage is at 1,000 yards, Grandpa. I'm shooting well, but I can feel the pressure building." Everyone expects the modern rifles to dominate at this distance. Sarah, her grandfather's voice was steady and reassuring. At 1,000 yards, the rifle doesn't matter as much as the person behind it. You've trained for this your entire life. Trust your instincts, trust your training, and trust that old rifle. It's been waiting 60 years for this moment. As the final stage began, the tension on the range was palpable. This was where reputations would be made or broken, where the true skill of each competitor would be revealed. The crowd had grown even larger, with Marines standing 3 deep behind the safety barriers to witness what many believed would be the end of Sarah's remarkable run. The challenge was about to begin, and Sarah knew that everything her grandfather had taught her, everything she had learned about patience, precision, and respect for the craft, would be put to the ultimate test in front of an audience that was waiting to see if skill and dedication could truly triumph over technology and reputation. The 1,000-yard firing line at Camp Pendleton had never hosted a more anticipated shooting competition. Word had spread beyond the base, reaching Marine installations across the country as news of the unusual contest traveled through military networks. Senior officers who normally wouldn't attend such events had cleared their schedules, and several shooting instructors from other bases had driven hours just to witness what many were calling the most important marksmanship demonstration in recent Marine Corps history. Sarah stood behind her grandfather's rifle, feeling the weight of history and expectation pressing down on her shoulders. The past 2 stages had proven that she could compete with the Corps' elite marksmen, but everyone knew that 1,000 yards was where modern technology was supposed to assert its dominance. The atmospheric conditions at extreme range created variables so complex that most shooters relied heavily on ballistic computers and environmental sensors to achieve consistent hits. Staff Sergeant Martinez checked his equipment one final time, running through a pre-shot routine that involved multiple electronic devices and a smartphone app that calculated precise firing solutions. His custom rifle was equipped with a scope that cost more than most people's annual salary, and the ammunition he was using had been manufactured to specifications that seemed impossibly precise. Everything about his setup represented the cutting edge of modern military marksmanship. Gunnery Sergeant Thompson's preparation was even more elaborate. His ballistic computer was processing data from wind sensors placed at multiple points downrange, creating a real-time map of atmospheric conditions. The ammunition he had selected was sorted by weight to within 1/10 of a grain, and each cartridge had been measured and cataloged for ballistic consistency. His rifle represented decades of technological advancement, incorporating materials and manufacturing techniques that would have seemed like science fiction when Sarah's rifle was built. Captain Williams approached the challenge differently, relying more on experience than technology. His equipment was expensive and precise, but his real advantage lay in years of competition experience and an intuitive understanding of long-range ballistics that couldn't be programmed into any computer. He had shot at 1,000 yards in conditions ranging from dead calm to near gale force winds, and his mental database of corrections and adjustments was legendary among competitive shooters. Against this array of modern expertise and equipment, Sarah prepared for the shot that would define her military career. She had no ballistic computer, no electronic wind sensors, and no precisely manufactured ammunition. What she did have was her grandfather's teaching, thousands of hours of practice, and a 60-year-old rifle that had been built when precision manufacturing meant skilled craftsmen working with hand tools rather than computer-controlled machines. The range conditions for the final stage were challenging but not impossible. A steady wind was blowing from the left at approximately 12 miles per hour, with occasional gusts that reached 15. The temperature was 72 degrees Fahrenheit, with moderate humidity that would affect bullet flight over the extended range. Most importantly, the atmospheric pressure was slightly below standard, meaning that bullets would travel a bit higher than normal calculations would predict. Colonel Hayes called the shooters together for final instructions. Ladies and gentlemen, the final stage will consist of 5 shots at 1,000 yards. You'll have unlimited time for each shot, but once you begin your sequence, you must complete all 5 rounds without leaving the firing line. Scoring will be based on group size and proximity to the center of the target. Questions. There were no questions. Each shooter understood the challenge and had developed their own strategy for managing the extreme range variables. The crowd had swelled to over 300 Marines, creating an atmosphere more typical of a major sporting event than a military demonstration. Martinez would shoot first, as he had in the previous stages. He settled behind his rifle and began the complex process of gathering environmental data and calculating his firing solution. His ballistic computer processed information for several minutes before displaying the recommended scope adjustments and holdover values. The crowd watched in fascination as he made minute adjustments to his scope, changed his ammunition selection, and finally settled into his final shooting position. His first shot at 1,000 yards was a process that took nearly 10 minutes from start to finish. The careful calculations, precise equipment adjustments, and methodical preparation produced a hit that was approximately 6 inches from the center of the target, an excellent result by any standard. His subsequent 4 shots created a respectable group, though the changing wind conditions prevented him from achieving the same level of precision he had demonstrated at shorter ranges. When Martinez finished his string, the official score was announced: 47 points out of a possible 50, with a group size of 8 inches. The crowd applauded appreciatively, recognizing the skill required to achieve such accuracy at extreme range. More importantly, Martinez had established a benchmark that would be difficult for the remaining shooters to exceed. Thompson approached the firing line with his characteristic methodical precision. His electronic systems had been monitoring conditions throughout Martinez's shooting sequence, and the ballistic computer had already calculated the optimal firing solution based on real-time environmental data. His preparation was faster than Martinez's, but even more thorough, incorporating data points that would have been impossible to gather manually. Thompson's shooting sequence was a masterclass in technical precision. Each shot was fired at exactly the moment when his wind sensors indicated optimal conditions, and his ballistic computer made real-time adjustments based on the observed bullet impacts. The result was a group that surpassed Martinez's performance in both accuracy and consistency. The official score confirmed what the spotters had already observed. 48 points with a group size of 6 inches. Thompson had demonstrated exactly why the Marine Corps invested heavily in modern technology and training methods. His systematic approach and advanced equipment had produced results that seemed to validate the superiority of modern marksmanship techniques. Captain Williams stepped to the firing line with the quiet confidence that had made him a legend among competitive shooters. Unlike the previous 2 shooters, he spent relatively little time on calculations and equipment adjustments. Instead, he focused on studying the natural wind indicators, grass movement, mirage patterns, and dust clouds that told him more about actual conditions than any electronic sensor could provide. Williams' shooting was poetry in motion. Each shot was fired with perfect timing, based on his ability to read momentary lulls in the wind and anticipate changes in atmospheric conditions. His decades of experience allowed him to make corrections instinctively, adjusting his point of aim based on feedback that was invisible to less experienced shooters. The result was predictably spectacular: 49 points with a group size of 4 inches. Williams had come within a single point of a perfect score, demonstrating the kind of shooting that had made him a Marine Corps legend. The crowd's appreciation was immediate and enthusiastic, recognizing that they had witnessed something truly special. Now it was Sarah's turn. She approached the firing line carrying the same rifle that had drawn laughter and skepticism just 3 weeks earlier. The crowd fell silent as she settled into position, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her earlier performances had been skill or luck. The pressure was enormous. She was representing not just herself but also her grandfather's legacy and the possibility that traditional methods could still compete with modern technology. Sarah's preparation routine was dramatically different from her competitors. She spent no time with calculations or equipment adjustments, focusing instead on the same natural indicators that her grandfather had taught her to read as a child. She watched the grass movement at various points downrange, studied the heat mirage through her scope, and felt the wind patterns on her face and hands. Her grandfather had taught her that successful long-range shooting was more about patience than precision. "Wait for the rifle to tell you when to shoot," he had said countless times. "The target, the wind, and your body will align for just a moment, and that's when you pull the trigger. Everything else is just noise." It had the main line of KOs of inmates in door cartridges who were first and contemplated for the experience of ending death references. That would have seemed primitive. This is the biggest hope of tacking death. This since the personal tension was an unknown, and that no mass production was in any event, the KO contingent of KOs of expert from these lines of contractions. The bullet was a simple lead core design that would have seemed primitive compared to the high-tech projectiles used by her competitors. She settled the rifle into her shoulder, feeling the familiar weight and balance that had become second nature through thousands of hours of practice. The scope was a basic 10-power model without any of the advanced features that decorated her competitors' weapons, but it was perfectly zeroed and had been proven reliable through decades of use. The first shot would set the tone for everything that followed. Sarah controlled her breathing, feeling for the natural respiratory pause that would provide maximum stability. She placed her finger on the trigger, a simple, unadorned piece of metal that had been polished smooth by 60 years of use, and waited for the moment her grandfather had taught her to recognize. The wind settled for just a few seconds, the grass stopped moving, and Sarah felt the perfect alignment between her body, the rifle, and the distant target. She pressed the trigger straight back with the steady pressure that had been drilled into her through countless repetitions, and the rifle fired with the distinctive crack of the .308 cartridge. The bullet's time of flight at 1,000 yards was approximately 1.2 seconds, an eternity in marksmanship terms, during which variables could change and affect the final impact point. But Sarah had learned to call her shots, meaning she could predict where the bullet would hit based on the sight picture and trigger press at the moment of firing. "Hit! Center ring!" called the spotter, confirming what Sarah had already known. Her first shot had found the center of the target, earning a perfect score. The crowd stirred with excitement, but Sarah remained focused on the task ahead. 4 more shots remained, and each one would be progressively more difficult as the pressure mounted. Her second shot followed the same careful process. Patience, natural reading of environmental conditions, and waiting for the perfect moment to fire. Again, the result was a center hit that earned another perfect score. The crowd was becoming more animated, sensing that they might be witnessing something unprecedented. Sarah's third shot created a stir among the spotters. Not only had she achieved another center hit, but the bullet had struck so close to her previous impacts that the holes were beginning to overlap. At 1,000 yards, such precision was almost unimaginable, yet Sarah was achieving it with equipment that predated most of the technologies her competitors were using. The fourth shot continued the pattern of perfection. By now, the crowd had fallen into complete silence, recognizing that they were witnessing something that might never be repeated. Sarah had achieved 4 consecutive perfect scores at 1,000 yards, something that even the most optimistic observers had considered virtually impossible. As Sarah prepared for her final shot, the pressure was unlike anything she had ever experienced. A perfect 5th shot would give her a perfect score at all 3 distances, something that no Marine in the recorded history of the Corps had ever achieved in formal competition. More importantly, it would validate everything her grandfather had taught her about the relationship between shooter and rifle, skill and equipment. The wind had picked up slightly since her 4th shot, creating conditions that would challenge even the most sophisticated ballistic computers. But Sarah had been tracking the patterns for the past hour, building a mental map of how the air moved across the range at different times and locations. She knew that within the next few minutes there would be another brief lull that would provide the window she needed. She waited, rifle ready but not yet aimed, watching the grass and feeling the air currents on her skin. Several minutes passed, longer than she had taken for any previous shot, as she patiently waited for the conditions to align. The crowd began to shift restlessly, wondering if the pressure had finally gotten to her. Then, suddenly, the wind died. Sarah smoothly shouldered her rifle, acquired the target through her scope, and settled into the shooting position that had become as natural as breathing. The crosshairs steadied on the center of the distant target. Her breathing paused at the natural respiratory break, and she pressed the trigger with the same steady pressure that had worked for 4 previous shots. The rifle fired, and Sarah knew immediately that the shot was perfect. The sight picture, the trigger press, the follow-through, everything had aligned exactly as her grandfather had taught her. Before the spotter could even announce the result, she knew that she had achieved something that would be talked about in Marine Corps marksmanship circles for decades to come. Hit, center ring, perfect score. The silence that followed lasted for several seconds as the full implications of Sarah's performance sank in. She had achieved 5 consecutive perfect scores at 1,000 yards, using a 60-year-old rifle that many had dismissed as obsolete. More importantly, she had done it under the kind of pressure that had broken many lesser shooters, proving that skill and dedication could indeed triumph over the most advanced technology. When the crowd finally erupted in cheers and applause, Sarah remained in position behind her rifle, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had not just won a competition, she had validated her grandfather's teaching methods, honored the legacy of his old rifle, and proven that the fundamentals of marksmanship were more important than any technological advancement. Colonel Hayes approached the firing line, her expression showing the kind of amazement that even decades of military experience hadn't prepared her for. "Private Chen," she said quietly, "in 30 years of Marine service, I have never seen anything like what you just accomplished. That was the finest display of marksmanship I've ever witnessed." The official scores confirmed what everyone had observed. Sarah had achieved a perfect 50 points at each distance, with a final group size at 1,000 yards that measured less than 2 inches. She had not just defeated her competitors, she had set a new standard for what was possible in military marksmanship. The news of Sarah's unprecedented shooting performance spread through military channels faster than anyone could have predicted. Within hours of the demonstration, phone calls were being made between Marine Corps bases across the country and beyond. Video footage of her final shots, captured by several Marines with cell phones, was being analyzed by marksmanship instructors and competitive shooters who could barely believe what they were seeing. Colonel Hayes knew that she had witnessed something that would change how the Marine Corps approached marksmanship training. But the immediate challenge was deciding what to do with Private Chen. Her performance had been so exceptional that it demanded official recognition, yet her unconventional methods and equipment made her difficult to categorize within existing military frameworks. Sergeant Mills, Colonel Hayes called during an emergency staff meeting convened the evening after the demonstration. I want you to tell me everything you know about Private Chen's background. Where did she learn to shoot like that? Mills had spent the afternoon gathering information about Sarah's civilian shooting experience. Ma'am, she grew up on a ranch in Montana, trained by her grandfather, who was a Korean War veteran. According to her enlistment records, she won several civilian competitions, but nothing at this level. Her grandfather taught her everything she knows, and apparently that rifle has been in the family since 1953. What about formal training? Military schools? Civilian academies? Anything that would explain this level of skill? Nothing, ma'am. Just what her grandfather taught her and what she learned in basic marksmanship training. But there's something else you should know. Mills paused, checking his notes. I made some calls to civilian shooting organizations in Montana. Sarah Chen has a reputation there as someone special. She won the state long-range championship 3 years running before she enlisted, shooting against competitors who had tens of thousands of dollars invested in equipment. Colonel Hayes leaned back in her chair, processing this information. So we have a Marine who learned to shoot from her grandfather using a 60-year-old rifle who just outshot some of the best marksmen in the Corps. And her background suggests this wasn't a fluke. That's correct, ma'am. The civilian competitors I spoke with said she had a gift for reading conditions and an understanding of ballistics that seemed almost intuitive. But they also said she was one of the most dedicated practitioners they had ever encountered. She would spend entire weekends at the range, working on technique and studying ammunition performance. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Colonel Hayes' office door. Her aide announced that General Morrison, the commanding officer of the entire Marine Corps West Coast Training Command, was on the phone with urgent questions about the day's demonstration. Colonel Hayes, the general's voice was serious but not unfriendly. I've been hearing some interesting stories about a marksmanship demonstration at your facility. I need you to tell me exactly what happened today. Colonel Hayes spent the next 20 minutes providing a detailed account of Sarah's performance, including the official scores and the reactions of the competing Marines. She could hear the general taking notes, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details. Colonel, I want you to understand that what you're describing would be remarkable for any Marine, but for a private with limited formal training to achieve these results against seasoned veterans is almost unprecedented. Are you absolutely certain about these scores? Sir, I personally witnessed the entire competition. The scores were verified by multiple spotters and confirmed by range safety officers. Private Chen achieved perfect scores at all 3 distances, with a final group at 1,000 yards that measured less than 2 inches. There was a long pause before General Morrison responded. Colonel, I'm going to be direct with you. The Marine Corps is facing some significant challenges in recruitment and retention, particularly among young people who see military service as outdated or irrelevant. Stories like this, a young Marine using traditional methods and equipment to outperform the latest technology. This could be exactly what we need to remind people about the values that make Marines special. The implications of the general's words were clear. Sarah's performance had caught the attention of senior leadership not just as a demonstration of marksmanship skill, but as a powerful symbol of Marine Corps values and traditions. The story of a young woman honoring her grandfather's legacy while achieving extraordinary results resonated on multiple levels. Sir, what are your recommendations regarding Private Chen? First, I want a complete evaluation of her training methods and equipment. If she's achieving these results with traditional techniques, we need to understand why our modern training programs aren't producing similar outcomes. Second, I want her available for demonstrations and possibly recruitment activities. And third, I want you to begin developing a program that incorporates some of her grandfather's teaching methods into our formal curriculum. The conversation with General Morrison set in motion a series of events that would transform Sarah's military career in ways she never could have anticipated. Within a week, she was receiving requests from Marine Corps recruiting stations across the country to participate in demonstrations and speaking engagements. Her story was being featured in Marine Corps publications and shared on social media platforms, as an example of what dedication and traditional values could accomplish. But the attention also brought unexpected challenges. Some Marines resented the focus on Sarah's unconventional methods, arguing that it undermined confidence in standard equipment and training programs. Others questioned whether her performance could be replicated or if it was simply an isolated example of exceptional natural talent. The most serious criticism came from Marines who had devoted their careers to developing and implementing modern marksmanship programs. They argued that promoting traditional methods over technological advances could set back decades of progress in military shooting instruction. Sarah found herself caught in the middle of a debate that extended far beyond her individual performance. Phone calls from her grandfather became more frequent as he tried to help her navigate the political complexities of military life while staying true to the values he had taught her. "Sarah," he said during one of their evening conversations, "I've been watching the news about what happened at your demonstration. I'm proud of what you accomplished, but I'm worried about the pressure they're putting on you now." "Grandpa, they want me to travel around the country giving demonstrations and talking about your training methods. Some of the older Marines think I'm criticizing their equipment and techniques just by using your rifle. That was never the point of what I taught you. The rifle is just a tool, and good Marines have been achieving excellent results with modern equipment for decades. What makes our approach different isn't the age of the equipment, it's the emphasis on patience, practice, and understanding the fundamentals." Thomas Chen paused, choosing his words carefully. "The most important thing you can do now is show respect for the Marines who came before you and the ones who serve beside you. Your success shouldn't diminish anyone else's achievements. It should inspire them to pursue excellence using whatever tools and methods work best for them." This wisdom guided Sarah through the increasingly complex demands of her new role as an unofficial spokesperson for traditional marksmanship methods. She began developing presentations that emphasized the universal principles underlying accurate shooting rather than promoting specific equipment or techniques. Her first major speaking engagement was at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, where she addressed a group of newly commissioned officers about the importance of marksmanship fundamentals. Instead of focusing on her equipment, she talked about the mental discipline required for precision shooting and the value of patient, consistent practice. "The rifle my grandfather gave me isn't special because it's old," she told the assembled officers. "It's special because it represents decades of careful maintenance, thousands of hours of practice, and a commitment to never settling for good enough. Those same principles apply regardless of what equipment you're using." The response from the audience was overwhelmingly positive. Young officers appreciated her emphasis on dedication and hard work, while more experienced Marines recognized the universal applicability of her message. Most importantly, Sarah had found a way to share her grandfather's wisdom without implying that modern methods were inferior. As word of her speaking ability spread, requests for appearances began coming from unexpected sources. Civilian shooting organizations wanted her to address their members about military marksmanship techniques. Law enforcement agencies were interested in her methods for reading environmental conditions and managing stress during precision shooting. Even corporate groups were requesting presentations about how her approach to marksmanship could be applied to business and leadership challenges. Sarah accepted these invitations selectively, always with the approval of her commanding officers, and always with the goal of representing the Marine Corps in a positive light. Her grandfather's rifle accompanied her to each event, not as a relic or curiosity, but as a working example of how proper care and respect for equipment could produce exceptional results. The most significant invitation came 3 months after the original demonstration. The National Rifle Association was hosting its annual convention in Dallas, and they wanted Sarah to participate in a special exhibition match against some of the best civilian competitive shooters in the country. The match would be televised nationally, giving Sarah a platform to reach millions of Americans with her message about dedication, tradition, and excellence. "This could be bigger than anything we've done so far," Colonel Hayes explained when she briefed Sarah about the invitation. "You'd be representing not just the Marine Corps, but the entire military, in front of a national audience. The responsibility would be enormous." Sarah understood the implications. Success would validate her methods and bring positive attention to the Marine Corps. Failure would be equally public and could undermine everything she had worked to accomplish. More importantly, she would be carrying her grandfather's legacy onto a stage where millions of people would judge not just her shooting ability, but everything he had taught her about honor, discipline, and respect for the craft. The decision to accept the invitation was ultimately easy. Her grandfather had raised her to meet challenges head-on, and this was simply the next test in a journey that had begun in childhood on a Montana ranch. She would carry the old rifle onto the biggest stage of her life, knowing that success or failure would rest entirely on the foundation of values and skills that Thomas Chen had spent decades helping her build. The months of preparation that followed would test not just Sarah's shooting ability, but her mental toughness, her commitment to her grandfather's teachings, and her ability to perform under pressure that exceeded anything she had previously experienced. The stakes were higher, the audience was larger, and the opportunity to inspire others was greater than anything she had ever imagined. But as she began preparing for the national exhibition, Sarah took comfort in knowing that the principles her grandfather had taught her were the same regardless of the venue or the audience. Patience, practice, respect for the fundamentals, and an unwavering commitment to excellence would serve her just as well in Dallas as they had on the firing line at Camp Pendleton. The Kay Bailey Hutchison Convention Center in Dallas had been transformed into something resembling a military command center crossed with a major sporting venue. The National Rifle Association's annual exhibition had drawn over 50,000 attendees, including some of the most skilled competitive shooters in the world. Television crews from major networks had set up elaborate broadcasting positions, and the main exhibition hall buzzed with the kind of energy typically reserved for championship sporting events. Sarah stood in the competitor staging area, methodically checking her grandfather's rifle for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The familiar weight of the 1953 Springfield M1A in her hands provided a sense of calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding the event. Around her, other competitors were making final adjustments to equipment that represented the absolute pinnacle of modern shooting technology. The format for the televised exhibition match had been designed for maximum drama and audience appeal. 8 shooters would compete in a series of increasingly difficult challenges, with eliminations after each stage until only 2 remained for a final head-to-head competition. The distances would range from 600 yards to an unprecedented 1,200 yards, pushing the limits of what was possible in competitive shooting. Sarah's competitors represented the elite of civilian marksmanship. There was David Chen, no relation to Sarah, who held multiple national records and had custom rifles worth more than most people's cars. Jennifer Martinez was a former Olympic team member whose precision was legendary among competitive shooters. Robert Thompson had dominated long-range competitions for over a decade using equipment that seemed more appropriate for space exploration than sporting events. Perhaps most intimidating was Marcus Williams, a former military sniper turned professional shooter, whose reputation for performing under pressure was unmatched. Williams had served 3 combat tours and claimed over 100 confirmed kills, making him not just a skilled competitor, but someone who had proven himself in life-or-death situations. The television broadcast would reach an estimated audience of 12 million viewers, many of whom would be learning about precision shooting for the first time. Sarah understood that she wasn't just representing herself or even the Marine Corps. She was carrying the responsibility of showing America what dedication, tradition, and proper training could accomplish. "Private Chen," a familiar voice called from behind her. Sarah turned to see General Morrison, who had flown in from California specifically to observe the competition. His presence added another layer of pressure to an already intense situation. "Sir." Sarah stood at attention, though the civilian setting made formal military protocol somewhat awkward. "At ease, Marine. I wanted to talk with you before the competition begins. The entire Marine Corps is watching this event, and I want you to know that we're proud of you regardless of the outcome." General Morrison paused, studying Sarah's expression. "But I also want you to understand that success here could open doors for the Corps that have been closed for years. Young people who see military service as outdated might think differently after watching you compete with your grandfather's rifle against the most modern equipment available." The pressure was enormous, but Sarah found strength in remembering her grandfather's words about honoring the legacy of those who came before while inspiring those who would follow. She had spent months preparing for this moment, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. The first stage of the competition was set at 600 yards, a distance designed to eliminate shooters who lacked fundamental skills or suffered from stage fright. Each competitor would fire 10 shots, with scoring based on total points and group size. The targets were precision bullseyes rather than military silhouettes, requiring a different kind of accuracy than Sarah was accustomed to. David Chen shot first, his ultra-modern rifle producing a group that drew appreciative murmurs from the knowledgeable audience. His equipment incorporated every technological advantage available to civilian shooters. Barrel systems that cost more than most cars, optics that could resolve targets at impossible distances, and ammunition manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Jennifer Martinez followed with a performance that demonstrated why she had nearly made the Olympic team. Her shooting was mechanical in its precision. Each shot fired with exactly the same body position, breathing pattern, and trigger press. The consistency was impressive, producing a score that would be difficult for any competitor to match. Robert Thompson's decade of dominance in long-range competition was evident in his relaxed confidence and methodical approach. His equipment was even more elaborate than his predecessors, incorporating environmental sensors and ballistic computers that made real-time adjustments based on changing conditions. Marcus Williams approached the firing line with the calm demeanor of someone who had faced far more serious challenges than any sporting competition could provide. His equipment was professional grade but not flashy, reflecting a practical approach developed through years of real-world application. Then, it was Sarah's turn to shoot. The television cameras focused on her as she approached the firing line carrying the rifle that looked so different from her competitors' weapons. The commentators provided background about her military service and her grandfather's Korean War experience, building the narrative of tradition versus technology that would define the broadcast. Sarah's preparation routine had remained unchanged despite the enormous audience and television coverage. She studied the wind indicators, checked her rifle's zero, and loaded the handcrafted cartridges that her grandfather had prepared specifically for this competition. The ammunition represented 60 years of accumulated knowledge about bullet design, powder charges, and precision manufacturing techniques. Her first shot at 600 yards produced the familiar crack of the .308 cartridge, followed by the distinctive sound of the M1A's action cycling. The spotter confirmed a perfect center hit, earning applause from the audience and surprised comments from the television announcers who had expected the antique rifle to be at a disadvantage. 9 more shots followed in steady succession, each one placed with mechanical precision in the center of the target. Sarah's final score was perfect, 10 consecutive bullseyes that created a group smaller than anything achieved by her technologically superior competitors. The second stage at 800 yards proved even more challenging as afternoon winds created swirling conditions that challenged every shooter's ability to read environmental factors. This was where Sarah's training in natural wind indicators began to show real advantages over electronic sensors that struggled with rapidly changing conditions. David Chen's sophisticated wind-reading equipment seemed to be having difficulty with the gusty conditions, producing shots that strayed from the center more frequently than his earlier performance. Jennifer Martinez adapted better, but her mechanical approach left little room for the kind of real-time adjustments that the conditions demanded. Robert Thompson's experience helped him manage the challenging environment better than the younger competitors, but even his advanced equipment couldn't completely compensate for winds that changed direction every few minutes. Marcus Williams demonstrated why combat experience was valuable in competitive shooting, reading conditions instinctively and making adjustments based on years of shooting in hostile environments. His performance was solid and consistent, establishing him as Sarah's primary competition for the remaining stages. Sarah approached the 800-yard stage with the confidence that came from a lifetime of shooting in Montana's variable mountain winds. She had learned to read grass movement, dust patterns, and atmospheric shimmer in ways that no electronic device could replicate. More importantly, she had developed the patience to wait for the brief moments when conditions aligned for perfect shots. Her performance at 800 yards was even more impressive than her earlier shooting, producing another perfect score despite conditions that had challenged every other competitor. The television audience was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A young Marine using traditional methods to outperform the most advanced technology available. The third stage eliminated half the remaining competitors, leaving only Sarah, Marcus Williams, Jennifer Martinez, and Robert Thompson for the 1,000-yard challenge. The television producers were clearly pleased with this development, as it set up compelling storylines for the final stages: military versus civilian, Traditional versus modern. Experience versus youth. At 1,000 yards, the challenges became exponential. Every variable that affected shorter distances was magnified, creating conditions where the smallest errors in judgment or technique could mean the difference between success and failure. The wind had picked up even more as the afternoon progressed, creating the kind of conditions that separated truly exceptional shooters from those who were merely very good. Jennifer Martinez shot first among the remaining competitors, demonstrating the precision that had made her famous in competitive circles. However, the extreme range and challenging conditions produced a group that was excellent by any standard but not quite perfect. Robert Thompson's experience and advanced equipment produced a similar result. Outstanding shooting that would have won most competitions but fell just short of the perfection required for this level of competition. Marcus Williams stepped to the firing line with the calm confidence of someone who had taken far more difficult shots under much more stressful conditions. His performance was methodical and professional, producing a group that was marginally better than his civilian competitors, and establishing a benchmark that would be difficult to exceed. The crowd fell silent as Sarah approached the firing line for what everyone recognized as the critical stage of the competition. A perfect performance here would virtually guarantee her advancement to the final round, while any significant errors could end her remarkable run. Sarah's routine remained unchanged, despite the pressure and the knowledge that millions of people were watching her every move. She studied the conditions, loaded her rifle with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized every shot of the competition, and settled into the shooting position that had become as natural as breathing. The 1,000-yard shots required every skill her grandfather had taught her, combined with the mental toughness that Marine Corps training had developed. Each shot demanded patience, precision, and the ability to execute under pressure that few shooters ever experienced. One by one, Sarah placed 10 perfect shots into the center of the distant target. The crowd's reaction grew with each successive hit, building to a crescendo of appreciation that acknowledged they were witnessing something that might never be repeated. Her final group measured less than 3 inches at 1,000 yards, a level of precision that seemed almost impossible with any equipment, let alone a 60-year-old rifle. The final stage would pit Sarah against Marcus Williams in a head-to-head competition at 1,200 yards, a distance that pushed the absolute limits of the rifles and ammunition being used. The format was simple. Each shooter would fire 5 shots, with the winner determined by group size and proximity to the target center. Williams shot first, demonstrating the skill and composure that had made him legendary among military and civilian shooters alike. His 5 shots created a respectable group that would have won most competitions, but the extreme range and challenging conditions prevented him from achieving the level of precision he had demonstrated at shorter distances. Sarah approached the final challenge knowing that everything her grandfather had taught her, everything she had learned about patience and dedication and respect for the craft, would be tested in the next few minutes. The television audience was completely silent, understanding that they were about to witness the conclusion of something truly extraordinary. Her preparation for the final stage was unhurried and methodical, reflecting the lessons learned through decades of her grandfather's patient instruction. She loaded each cartridge with careful attention, checked her scope settings one final time, and settled into the shooting position that had carried her through every stage of the competition. The first shot at 1,200 yards was perfect, finding the exact center of the target despite conditions that would have challenged any shooter. 4 more shots followed, each one placed with mechanical precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics and probability. When the final scores were announced, Sarah had achieved something that no one in the audience had believed possible. She had won the national exhibition with a perfect score at every distance, using equipment that predated most of the technologies her competitors relied upon. The aftermath of the competition was immediate and overwhelming. Interview requests poured in from media outlets across the country, and Sarah found herself representing not just the Marine Corps, but traditional American values of dedication, respect for heritage, and the belief that excellence could be achieved through hard work and proper training. But perhaps the most important moment came when she called her grandfather that evening to share the news of her victory. "Grandpa, I won. The old rifle did everything you said it would, and more." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for several seconds before Thomas Chen responded, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, I knew that rifle would serve you well. But what you accomplished today went far beyond anything I could have imagined. You honored our family, the Marine Corps, and everyone who believes that the old ways still have value in the modern world. The story of Sarah Chen and her grandfather's rifle had become something much larger than a simple competition victory. It had become a reminder that excellence could be achieved through dedication to fundamental principles, that modern technology was no substitute for proper training in mental discipline, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from having the newest equipment, but from understanding and respecting the proven methods of those who came before. Years later, Sarah's performance at the Dallas exhibition would be remembered as a turning point in how the military and civilian communities viewed the relationship between tradition and innovation. Her story inspired a new generation of shooters to focus on fundamentals rather than equipment, and her grandfather's training methods were incorporated into marksmanship programs across the country. The old rifle returned to Montana with Sarah, where it continued to serve as both a functional tool and a symbol of the enduring power of dedication, patience, and respect for the craft. And sometimes, on quiet mornings at the family ranch, Sarah would take it to the range where her grandfather had first taught her to shoot, remembering the lessons that had carried her from a small farming town to national recognition, and preparing to pass those same lessons on to the next generation.